Okay guys, welcome back to part 2 of our tissues lecture. Now, we've spent the last part talking about epithelial tissue, and you learned about all the different kinds of epithelial tissue: squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional, all those etc. kinds of epithelial tissues. Now, the real trick with that is to learn what kind of epithelial tissue to expect to find in what parts of the body. For example, pseudostratified columnar epithelium, trachea is probably a good place to look for that. Transitional, you know that's in the urinary system. Well, anyway, enough about epithelium for now. Right now we're going to go over CT, that is connective tissue. Now, connective tissue gets even more complicated. There's so many subcategories and subdivisions, gets even more complicated than epithelial tissue, but we're going to try to break it down. Now, when we go over this, keep in mind the definition of tissue, right? A tissue is where you have cells working together for a common function, and that is certainly true of connective tissue. We're talking about cells, and these cells actually produce a substance called extracellular matrix, or sometimes people call it ground substance, and this is the stuff that is going to be it actually serves a lot of different purposes, but in general, it's kind of the stuffing. So imagine you're baking your Thanksgiving turkey, and you put the stuffing in there, and that kind of rounds it out and fills it and holds one side to the other, etc. That's kind of what connective tissue is all about. So connective tissue connects one structure to another, and it comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. So CT, connective tissue, is the glue or the filler of the body. And you can see this. So for example, one kind of connective tissue is called adipose tissue. That's your fat, and of course we're all stuffed up with fat. Well, some of us more than others, like myself. But you know, it's still cushioning, but that cushioning is also cushioning for our organs. We have connective tissue that is in our joints that provides, it acts as a shock absorber. So it's stuffing, it's a filler, it's a glue. So some of the common examples of connective tissue are tendons, right? So you guys know what tendons do. They secure muscles to bones, so that's a kind of connective tissue. Ligaments secure bone to bone. We already said the body fat, the adipose, which you see over here. And cartilage, right? Cartilage. Where do you find cartilage? Well, you find it all over the place, right? In your nose. You find it in your ear. You know, babies have lots of cartilage. They haven't had enough ossification yet, right? They haven't gotten their cartilage converting to bone yet. But everything you see on this slide are different types of connective tissue. And so the idea is, by the end of this lecture, I hope that if I've done my job right and you've studied, which is your job, you'll be able to actually look at a tissue specimen and identify what kind of connective tissue you're dealing with and what the function of that connective tissue is. Form and function, right? That's the theme of A&P. So let's first take some general connective tissue and look at what some of the structural components are that we might find in connective tissue. So this diagram right here gives you kind of a good overview of what all the stuff is in the stuffing. We said ground substance. Ground substance is, it could be made up of several things, a variety of things. We'll go over the specifics soon, but basically it's compounds, it's molecules. It could be complex sugars, polysaccharides. It could be proteins, a combination of those things, and fluid. But that's called ground substance. It also has a lot of protein fibers all through it. So connective tissue is fibrous. And if I get out my handy dandy pen here, let me see if how my handwriting will act today. Fibrous. Fibrous meaning full of fibers. And in this case, the fibers are made of proteins. And depending on the kind of connective tissue you're dealing with, there are different kinds of fibers. So some are thin, some are thick, some are dark, some are light. So we're going to be talking about these different kinds of fibers. So we have elastic fibers. We have collagen fibers, which you've probably heard about before, right? You know, people that get their faces treated, their skin treatments on their faces. They use products that supposedly help, with the collagen restoration, etc. Reticular fibers. So these are three types of fibers. Protein fibers. They're made out of proteins, which are made of amino acids. And these different fibers in their different combinations make the different kinds of connective tissue. Now, this is a tissue, so it's full of cells. So you also have cells that you find throughout connective tissue. And one of the main kinds you'll notice is something called a fibroblast. And of course, fibro means fiber. Blast refers to a cell that's doing something. So these are cells that actually produce fibers. So they're actually creating the ground substance and they're creating these protein fibers. You might find some fat cells in there. So this would be an adipocyte, a cell that creates fat. And you have immune cells like this macrophage here. So later on, when you learn about the immune system, you'll learn about macrophages. That I call them the Pac-Man cells because they like to chomp, chomp, chomp and eat things like bacteria. So those are macrophage, literally means big eater. And you'll find blood vessels all through the extracellular matrix. So you got blood vessels through there. And other cells called mesenchymal cells. So these are different kinds of cells you'll find in there, but the fibroblasts really are the ones that are kind of the most apparent when you're looking at connective tissues. But all of these fibers and the ground substance together make up your extracellular matrix. Okay, so that's your extracellular matrix. And it's really the look of the extracellular matrix that allows you to identify the different types of connective tissue. Okay, so just to summarize again, we have our protein fibers. These are elastic fibers, collagen fibers, and reticular fibers. So say that with me, elastic, collagen, and reticular. You have your ground substance, which is made up of stuff, of compounds. So we got proteins in there, we got complex carbohydrates in there, you have fluid like water, of course, and you also have some salts in there. So this ground substance with our protein fibers creates our extracellular matrix. So you'll hear us use the term extracellular matrix all the time throughout A&P, especially when we get into physiology and we're talking about the movement of molecules in and out of cell membranes. Well, if you're outside of the cell, you're in the extracellular matrix, right? So just get used to that term, get used to the term ground substance, because we say those things all the time. Okay, so now let's go over the functions of connective tissue. And you see right here a lovely picture of some connective tissue. And again, very soon you'll be able to identify what kind of connective tissue we are looking at there. But like so many things in our body, like the epithelial layers we were talking about before, connective tissue is a protective tissue. In many cases, it's providing physical protection. Now, whereas the epithelial layer, for example, on your skin is protecting you from the outside, your connective tissue is really providing internal protection. When you're bending over, you don't want your liver like smashing in to another organ, like your intestine, right? You need some kind of stuffing in the middle to protect you from the friction that would be generated and the trauma, the impact. So connective tissue can do that, can serve a protective role. And as we said, your adipose tissue, your fat, is definitely protective, right? It's going to cushion your organs, among other things. Now, connective tissue can also provide a support or a structural framework. So one of the things you'll learn in a little bit is one kind of connective tissue, believe it or not, is bone. You're like, bone is connective tissue? That doesn't seem to make sense, but it is. It's kind of the far extreme of the kinds of connective tissue you can get. And that bone obviously has a support or a structural function to it, right? You have your leg bones, and gravity is constantly pushing down on your body, and you're constantly walking or running or jumping or doing what it is that we do, and that's putting a lot of pressure on our body. And so we would just collapse and become this like blob if we didn't have those structural components to keep us upright and keep us intact. And so bone is an example of a structural connective tissue. As we said before, some connective tissues like tendons and ligaments have a binding function. They're actually binding one kind of tissue to another tissue. In the case of tendons, you're binding muscle tissue to bone tissue. And in the case of ligaments, you're binding bone tissue to bone tissue. So they can serve a binding function. You'll also learn about connective tissue that binds to the epithelial layer. So again, a binding or a glue-like function to it. In the case of adipose tissue, it's not just about protection and stuffing, it's also about storage. So many of you already know that fat is a storage mechanism. It's, you ate a little too much pizza the night before, whatever you didn't digest and use as fuel to create energy in your cells, whatever you didn't digest is going to be stored as fat for a rainy day when you go through some kind of starvation mechanism. That's why yo-yo diets don't work, right? You starve yourself, okay, you lose weight, but then as soon as you start eating again, your body says, I'm not going to let you starve me like that again. Whatever you eat, I'm going to store as fat so that I'll be ready for the next time you decide to go yo-yoing with me, right? Okay, now here's something even crazier. Okay, we talked about bone as being kind of an extreme of connective tissue. And in fact, let me see if I can write a little thing here that will kind of put this in perspective. So we're going to create a little spectrum here for connective tissue. So we already talked about bone, so let's write bone here. Okay, so there's our bone. But at the other extreme of the spectrum, we have blood. Blood. So I'm going to put like this little arrow here to represent the spectrum. We have blood. So we got bone, we got blood. Yes, blood is a connective tissue. Now, that seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like you think of connective tissue as connecting things, but blood is a connective tissue. And one of the functions of connective tissue is transport. Well, obviously, blood is a transporter, right? Blood contains hemoglobin, carries oxygen to our cells, takes carbon dioxide away, carries nutrients. So blood is a fluid connective tissue. It's for transport. So bone is for structural, supportive function. At the other extreme, blood is for transport. And then there's everything in the middle. So you can also say that connective tissue supports an immune function. Immune function, really? Yes, because think about it. Blood also has white blood cells, which are your immune cells, right? It helps to fight off the bad guys that get in there. So we already talked about macrophages, chomp, 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 eating the bad bacteria and the bad critters that are there. Well, macrophages are often carried through blood, and they like to settle in other types of connective tissue. So indeed, connective tissue can have an immune function. And in fact, one of the places where you'll find connective tissue is in your lymphatic organs, like your spleen and your lymph nodes, right? These are places where immune cells are produced, and you'll actually see a special kind of typical connective tissue that we'll talk about soon, or that I just you just heard the word, but the actual tissue called reticular connective tissue. Physical protection, support structural framework, binding of structures, storage, transport, and immune protection. Those are some of the main functions of connective tissue. Now, this diagram right here, this little table, this thing will be your best friend for keeping all of this straight, because connective tissue, as I mentioned, has so many compartments and subcompartments, and it's really going to make you crazy to try to keep it all straight unless you have a way to kind of say, okay, these guys have maybe similar functions or similar structures, so we can put them in the same category, etc. So sleep with this table under your pillow, and it'll make things a lot easier. So this is kind of how we structure this lecture. We're going to say, okay, all of these guys are connective tissue. Now let's break it down. Okay, so they're all produced by the same kinds of cell, the mesenchyme cells, but they can serve three different categories of, and then there's subcategories under that. So we have connective tissue proper, and I'm going to actually change the ink color here to something that will show up just a little bit better. Okay, so connective tissue proper, this is often called CT proper. Okay, so you'll hear me refer to CT proper on a regular basis. Okay, so CT proper. And, okay, so that's this guy here, CT proper. Okay, so CT proper is divided into two categories. We have loose connective tissue and we have dense connective tissue. So one group is CT proper, connective tissue proper, divided into two main categories, loose and dense. And we'll go over this again and again. Then the second category is supporting CT, supporting connective tissue. So these are connective tissues that provide support. And we have bone, which we already talked about. And we have something kind of like bone, but softer, and that is cartilage. Okay, so cartilage is a semi-solid ground substance, a semi-solid matrix. Bone, of course, that's solid, right? So connective tissue proper, loose versus dense. Supporting connective tissue, cartilage versus bone. And then finally, the third category is all by itself. That one we can just do right now. It's easy, and that is blood. So fluid connective tissue is blood. And then you can see under each of these, we have these different categories. So let's again go over the three main types of connective tissue from the time you're born. Connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. Okay, so we got that. Connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. Okay, so now let's see if we can go over the categories within each of those. So let's just take a look first at loose connective tissue. So we'll go over the characteristics, but loose connective tissue is, well, it's loose, right? A lot of ground substance, a lot of extracellular matrix, not as many of those protein fibers going through them. So it's kind of loose. There's a lot of space between these protein fibers. And there's three types for this. So we already talked about adipose tissue a little bit, and we'll go into more detail about adipose tissue. But we got another category here called the areolar connective tissue. So areolar connective tissue proper, adipose connective tissue proper, and the third is what I mentioned when we're talking about lymph organs, reticular connective tissue proper. Or let's go over the whole thing. Areolar loose connective tissue proper, adipose loose connective tissue proper, reticular loose connective tissue proper. So I'm going to think of this like a pirate, because we'll pretend to talk like a pirate day. Arr, arr, A-A-R, areolar, adipose, reticular. Arr, those are your loose connective tissues. Okay, arr, loose connective tissues. Arr, loose. Are you loose? Are you loose? Okay, you get it. Okay, yes, I'm crazy. But all right, now let's go over the dense connective tissue propers. So dense is dense, right? Tons of dense fibers, protein fibers, a lot of collagen, all stuck together. And how they're stuck together is what distinguishes the three types of dense connective tissue proper. So if these fibers are all nice and parallel to each other and kind of stacked and uniformly spaced, then that's regular. Okay, that's dense, regular connective tissue. But if those fibers are they're dense, there's lots of them, but they're all kind of doing their own thing, that is an irregular array of fibers, and so we call that dense, irregular connective tissue. So you can see kind of memorizing these charts will really help you keep it straight. So we have dense regular, dense irregular, and the third kind is cool. It's called dense elastic connective tissue proper. So elastic means it's elastic, it's stretchy. And that's really important because a lot of places in our body need to be able to stretch the tissue out. And so elastic connective tissue is going to have a lot of elastin, a lot of elastic protein fibers that will kind of snap back into place after you've stretched them. Okay, so again, what are the loose? R, right? Adipose, areolar, and reticular. Now let's see if we can come up with a mnemonic for regular, irregular, and elastic. R-I-E? I can't think of a mnemonic for that right off the top of my head, but R-I-E. Okay, so regular, irregular, elastic. Those are our dense connective tissues. Now going over to the cartilage. Now you guys know what cartilage is, and we'll go over it a little bit later, but obviously, you know, you have cartilage in all sorts of places in your body. But for these, the most common type is called hyaline. Then we have fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage. Now here is where I'm actually going to change the color of this ink, and I am going to write a big, like, I don't know, I'm going to write like a big like star and an unhappy face here, because this is where people will get driven crazy, that there's two kinds of connective tissue, both called elastic. One is in the dense connective tissue category under connective tissue proper. The other one is a type of cartilage, which is a type of supporting connective tissue. Both are called elastic. We'll try to keep those straight, but just to kind of alert you, be careful. And then, of course, we have elastic fibers, too. So that one's always a stumper. So hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic are the different kinds of cartilage, which is a type of supporting connective tissue. And then we got bone, and we already said that has a supportive role. So there's actually two types of bone. A lot of people don't know this. We have compact bone, which is the really hard, calcium-rich bone that you think of. That's the stuff on the outside. Like if you took your thigh bone and you split it down the middle, you did a sagittal cut, and looked at it, the outside part, the really bony, you know, rim is the compact bone. All the stuff in the middle with the cross, like, you know, kind of looks like hash marks, that is spongy bone. Okay, so those are two types of bone. And then here's our fluid connective tissue, and here's red for blood. I'll even draw you a little blood drop there. If I was a good artist, I'd draw you a Dracula, but I'm not, so I'll just draw you a blood drop. Okay, so I'll put this table up for you also so that you can download it, and I think it'll really help you for studying. Okay, so again, connective tissue is the extracellular matrix, which is proteins and fibers, you know, and the polysaccharides as well. And we're going to go over those different four types that we just talked about in just a sec. So let's go ahead and go back to AP Revealed and watch a little video overview that summarizes what we just went over, and then we'll go back into more detail about it in just a sec. Sound good? All right, so let's get going on that. Okay, so we're here at AP Revealed. Let's go ahead and go back to our tissues section here. And if we go to movies, all content, we're going to go to the connective tissue overview. Here we go.
Connective tissue is diverse, abundant, and widely distributed through the body. Its primary functions include structural support, binding structures together, fat storage, exchange of nutrients and metabolic waste, and defense and protection. All connective tissues share three basic components: cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. Together, the protein fibers and ground substance form the extracellular matrix. The proportions of these components, in addition to different cells and protein fibers, help define the various categories of connective tissue. In the adult, connective tissue can be divided into three broad categories: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, and fluid connective tissue. There are two basic subcategories of connective tissue proper: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Loose connective tissue has abundant ground substance with scattered cells and loosely arranged protein fibers. By comparison, dense connective tissue has abundant, tightly packed fibers, but relatively few cells and little ground substance. Loose connective tissue can be subdivided into areolar, adipose, and reticular connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is found in the subcutaneous layer and around organs. It has a gel-like ground substance, numerous blood vessels, and scattered cells known as fibroblasts. Adipose connective tissue is found in subcutaneous tissue and around some organs. It is composed of closely packed adipocytes or fat cells. Reticular connective tissue forms the stroma, a connective tissue framework, of lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, and bone marrow. It is composed of a network of branched collagen fibers, known as reticular fibers, with scattered fibroblasts and leukocytes, or white blood cells, embedded in a gel-like ground substance. Dense connective tissue can be subdivided into dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue forms tendons and most ligaments. It is composed of densely packed parallel collagen fibers with fibroblasts between the layers. There is little ground substance. Dense irregular connective tissue is found in the dermis, periosteum and perichondrium, and the capsule of organs. This type of connective tissue is composed predominantly of randomly arranged collagen fibers with fibroblasts interspersed. There is more ground substance than found in dense regular connective tissue. Elastic tissue is found in the walls of elastic arteries, the trachea and bronchi, and the vocal cords. This type of connective tissue is composed predominantly of branching elastic fibers, with fibroblasts in some spaces between the fibers. Elastic fibers, formed by the protein elastin, stretch under tension and then return to their original shape when tension is released. Supporting connective tissue can be subdivided into cartilage and bone. Cartilage has a semi-solid extracellular matrix that allows flexibility, whereas the solid matrix of bone is more rigid and provides greater support. There are three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type. It is found on the articular surfaces of synovial joints. It also forms the cartilage of the larynx, trachea, and nose. Chondrocytes, or mature cartilage cells, are found within small spaces called lacunae that are scattered irregularly in the extracellular matrix. Collagen fibrils are present within the matrix but not visible in the light microscope. A perichondrium, a dense irregular connective tissue sheath, overlies most cartilage. Elastic cartilage is found in the external ear and in the epiglottis. It contains abundant elastic fibers, which form a web-like mesh around lacunae that contain chondrocytes. Like hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage usually has a perichondrium. Fibrocartilage is found in intervertebral discs, the pubic symphysis, and the menisci of the knee joint. It contains numerous irregular bundles of collagen fibers. The sparse ground substance contains chondrocytes within lacunae that are frequently arranged in parallel rows. Unlike hyaline and elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage does not have a perichondrium. There are two forms of bone or osseous connective tissue: compact bone and spongy bone. Compact bone usually forms the hard outer shell of bones. Concentric rings of bone, called lamellae, form cylindrical structures known as osteons. Each osteon has a central canal that connects to a network of tiny branching passageways called canaliculi. The central canal and canaliculi contain blood vessels. Osteocytes, or mature bone cells, occupy lacunae, small spaces, between neighboring lamellae. Spongy bone, also known as cancellous bone, usually forms inside of bones. It does not contain osteons. Slender bony plates, called trabeculae, form a bony network. The spaces between trabeculae contain bone marrow and blood vessels. Osteocytes are scattered throughout the trabeculae. The combination of compact and spongy bone allows bones to be both strong and lightweight. Fluid connective tissue is represented by blood. The formed elements of blood, specifically its cells and cell fragments, include erythrocytes, or red blood cells, leukocytes, or white blood cells, and platelets. The watery ground substance of blood contains dissolved protein fibers.
Okay, so you know now the different categories of connective tissue. Now let's start getting a little more specific into connective tissue proper. And so in connective tissue proper, again, it's the arrangement of those protein fibers that give it its characteristic of whether it's in the loose category or the dense category. So these fibers are produced by cells that are in the tissue, and they're secreted directly into the extracellular matrix. And so just recall that these little skinny ones are called elastic fibers. They're made out of the protein elastin. And you have thicker fibers like you see here, and those are called collagen fibers, so collagen protein. And all these little things here, these little dark places, those are the nuclei of fibroblast cells that produce these fibers in the first place. And then all of the space here is your ground substance. So notice that in this particular example, we're looking at the papillary layer of the dermis. Well, this is going to be, this particular small layer is obviously going to be a kind of loose connective tissue. It's lots of ground substance there. Looks like spider webs going all over the place with the fibers. And here's a drawing of it just so you can get a general idea of how spaced out these fibers are and that the cells are just scattered all over the place. So we have collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and we have reticular fibers, which are not shown here on this slide, but obviously reticular loose connective tissue would have lots of reticular fibers, and those are going to stain very, very dark. Okay, so again, we have loose connective tissue proper and dense connective tissue proper. Just to restate, loose, less protein fibers; dense, more protein fibers. Loose, more ground substance; dense, less ground substance. Okay, and this little table here shows you the two categories, loose versus dense. So you remember loose has areolar, or if you prefer areolar, depending on how you like to pronounce it, adipose, and reticular, R, right? And dense connective tissue has dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic connective tissue. Now, what I like here is that this table really kind of shows you what the function of each of these types are. So we already said areolar or areolar is fascia, right? You'll see that, you know, when you pull the skin back on your specimen that you're going to be dissecting. So it's packing material. That's packing peanuts. It packs and binds around organs. Fat, adipose tissue, we already said it's for storage and it's for protection, insulation. And reticular connective tissue, it has all these dark reticular fibers in there. So this is found in a lot of lymphatic organs like the spleen. And so if you look at the location here, it tells you where you're going to find these. So areolar, you're going to see it around nerve cells. You're going to see it around blood vessels and the subcutaneous layer of your skin. Whereas your adipose tissue, I mean, pretty much you can find this anywhere, right? It's going to be around certain organs, around your kidney. In fact, if you take a kidney out, like when you dissect your cat and you take the kidney out, you'll see a lot of fat on there. And of course, beneath your skin as well, so your subcutaneous layer. Now the dense connective tissue, so dense regular, that nice like uniform one, you're going to see this in your tendons and your ligaments. And you know, even when you're, if you're chopping up some steak, I mean, you're going to see some tendons in there, and you're going to see how nice and uniform they are and thick. So it's for a lot of strength and for flexibility. So, it's not going to break when you go like this. It's stretchy a little bit, and that gives it that tensile strength so that, your muscles aren't going to just rip off your bone when you do some activity. So densely packed collagen fibers. Dense irregular, they're also densely packed, but they're all over the place. They don't follow that nice uniform pattern that you see in the dense regular. And so this is also for tensile strength, but it can do it in multiple directions. So your tendons, which are dense regular, you have that tensile strength, but it can kind of only go in, one direction. Dense irregular is for when you need that to go all over the place. So for example, the dermis of your skin under your epidermis. you want some strength there in all directions. So that would be dense, irregular connective tissue. And in fact, as you age, the dense, irregular connective tissue kind of breaks down. And so, your skin's not as pliable anymore. You lose that youthful look. You also see dense, irregular connective tissue around the capsules of organs. So, for example, if you took a kidney out, there's this nice sort of tough capsule around it, and that would be dense, irregular connective tissue. Now you have elastic connective tissue, and you're going to find this around parts of the body that need to be able to stretch and snap back. So the walls of your large arteries, like your aorta and your heart, lots of elastic connective tissue there, because as blood's being forced through there, that thing has to stretch, but then you want it to go back to its normal shape. So you need that elastin protein in there. So that is elastic dense connective tissue. Okay, so moving on in here, we're looking at adipose connective tissue. And so as you saw in the video, adipose connective tissue is very easy to identify. It doesn't look like anything like the rest of the connective tissue. You see this huge blob here. It's a fat blob. It's a blob of fatty oil, so it's fat oil. And then over to the side, so each one of these is part of one adipocyte, one fat cell, a cell that produces fat. And around it is the cell membrane and the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm is just squished up to the top, because as the cell fills with oil droplets, it just pushes the cytoplasm to the cell membrane. And so you end up getting the nucleus of the cell and the organelles all squished into one part. And so here's your squishy part here that contains your nucleus and your organelles, and pretty much everything else is cytoplasm squished up against the cell membrane. And all this in here is fat. That's an oil droplet. So when you lose weight, you literally are shrinking this droplet here, but it'll never go back to its original size, the cell. It'll always be capable of quickly filling back up with fat again. That's why it's easy to gain weight once you've already had that weight, because you've already stretched out that cell, so to speak. Okay, so that is adipose connective tissue. So I think you guys can identify that. This one, because this is a little rarer in the body, you find reticular connective tissue associated with your immune organs. So this is a cross-section from the spleen, which is an immune organ, and it's in the stroma, which is kind of like the middle of the spleen. But the dead giveaway here of reticular connective tissue is the reticular fibers. So that's all these dark colored fibers here. So those are reticular fibers. And because it's an immune organ, you're also going to have lots of leukocytes. And of course, we know that leukocytes are the same thing as white blood cells. Macrophages, lymphocytes, you name it, all those different kinds of white blood cells, neutrophils, eosinophils. And there's also, notice, lots of space here, so lots of ground substance. But again, the dead giveaway is the dark reticular fibers. So when you're looking at a micrograph, these reticular fibers stain dark. And that's how, if you see a bunch of dark spider webs in there, you go, reticular connective tissue. Now, you'll hear this word reticula or reticulum or reticular. You hear that a lot in A&P for different things. Reticular actually means network. So it's a network of fibers in this case, and therefore they call it reticular connective tissue. But it means a network. And here's, of course, over here a drawing of this picture right here, so you can kind of just get a easier view of these reticular fibers, the lymphocytes, and the ground substance. Okay, so that's reticular connective tissue, which is a loose connective tissue of the category connective tissue proper. And then here's our dense regular. So we've already shown you this. Again, those nice regular pattern of collagen fibers. Here's a nucleus of a fibroblast, so that you can see the fibroblasts that produce the collagen are just kind of scattered here and there. But this is of tendons and ligaments. Okay, so you know that. And then dense irregular. So this is dense irregular, and it looks like, I don't know, meat. I mean, it's just like, so that is dense irregular. You still kind of see how you have those closely packed collagen fibers, but they're not going in one direction. Some go this way, some go that way, some go, etc. They still have fibroblasts scattered through there, so tissues have cells. So here's the nucleus of a fibroblast. And it has a lot more ground substance than the dense regular. Okay, so this is again making up your dermis, the deep part of your skin, and the capsules around your organs. Okay, so like kidneys, liver, spleen, etc. Okay, so that is the dense irregular connective tissue. And then here's your elastic. So elastic is also going to have the fibers stained dark, but notice how much denser they are together than what you found in the reticular. So reticular connective tissue had lots of ground substance. Here there is just not as much ground substance there as you had in the reticular. So, and these elastin fibers, the elastic fibers, are going to allow stretchy, 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 stretchy. So not only do you have it in your aorta, like you see here, of your heart, but your vocal cords, you know, pretty much your trachea, anything that needs to stretch and come back. You're talking about elastic connective tissue. Okay, now on to the supporting connective tissue. Again, we said that we have cartilage and we have bone. So these are the two types of connective tissue, cartilage and bone. So here is obviously cartilage, and you know it by the lacunae that it has, the lacunae with the chondrocytes. So if you see this, you automatically say, okay, that is going to be some type of cartilage, right? We know that, right? Some type of cartilage. And, you know, oftentimes it has this outer layer here called the perichondrium. And let me see if I can grab my pen here, and I will write that. I will write up here, perichondrium. That looks really horrible. Okay, so let's see if I can write that here. Perichondrium, C-H-O-N-D-R-I-U-M. Wow, that's really bad. P-E-R-I-C-H-O-N-D-R-I-U-M. That's perichondrium. So that is what we see on the outside here. So some cartilage has that. But again, the dead giveaway for cartilage is seeing these lacunae with the chondrocytes in them. So chondro means cartilage. Chondrocytes are cells that produce the cartilage ground substance. And then we see here bone. And again, there's two types of bone. There is compact bone, which is what we're looking at here. And a cross section always has these osteons here. And there's spongy bone. So let's look a little more at these chondrocytes. So here's a drawing, and what we're looking at here is hyaline cartilage. So I'll just write that. This is hyaline. And this is the most common type of cartilage in the body. And so when in doubt, say hyaline, because your nose cartilage, your costal cartilage, that means your rib cartilage, the cartilage that makes up much of what will become bone in a fetus, the cartilage that makes up a lot of what's covering the joints, inside of the joints of your knee, your shoulder, things like that, it looks like this. So you have your lacunae with the chondrocytes, but you have lots of ground matrix here, and it's really kind of jelly-like, and it just looks smooth. So you can't actually see the collagen fibers. They're there, but under a microscope you can't see them. So lots of ground substance, looks smooth under a microscope, and you have a lot of lacunae with chondrocytes, but they're kind of spaced far apart overall from each other. Okay, so that is hyaline cartilage. Okay, so notice that they've labeled your hyaline cartilage over here. So there's your ground matrix. Here's your lacunae, and there's your chondrocytes inside. So hyaline cartilage, most common type, also the weakest. You can move it around. You find it in your trachea, your larynx, we already said your nose, etc. Fibrocartilage is the second type of supportive connective cartilage tissue. And fibrocartilage is not found in a whole lot of places. And you can see it looks very different from the hyaline cartilage. There's a lot of ground matrix here, so lots of ground matrix. The lacunae with the chondrocytes are spaced more apart from each other. And you'll notice that the collagen fibers are a little bit wavy. Okay, so they tend to be parallel, but they're a little bit wavy. Okay, so that is fibrocartilage. So they say that the cartilage has collagen fibers that are tightly interwoven with each other, but that makes them have that kind of wavy appearance. So where do you find fibrocartilage? So you're going to find it in places where you get a lot of shock. So you're going to find it if you take your knee joint, you know, lining the inside of that joint is hyaline cartilage, but right between the two bones where that shock occurs, there's going to be some pads of fibrocartilage. Also, the cartilage between your vertebrae in your spine, boom, 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 lots of shock there. So you're going to have fibrocartilage to be a shock absorber in your spine. And in fact, you've heard of people with slip discs. What that means is that the fibrocartilage has gotten out of place, or in some cases for people, the fibrocartilage gets really squished and it doesn't have that shock absorbing cushion anymore. And that causes big problems for people, a lot of pain. You also find fibrocartilage in your pubic symphysis. And you're like, what in the world is the pubic symphysis? Well, you'll learn this when we start the skeletal system because you'll study the pelvis. But I'm going to attempt here to draw a pelvis. Wow, I'm really bad at this. But okay, so imagine this is your pelvis, right? Your legs are coming off here, etc. Well, and you know, of course, your pelvis is hollow in the middle. Well, it turns out these are different bones that come together in the middle. And right where they come together, right there, is the pubic symphysis. And that pubic symphysis is a piece of cartilage made out of fibrocartilage. So there you go. All right, and then we have the third type, which is elastic cartilage. And the easy way to remember elastic cartilage is it's really only found in two places in the body. And both of those places start with the letter E. So E for elastic cartilage, E for ear, your external ear, and E for your epiglottis. So the epiglottis is that little flap that closes when you swallow to allow your food to go down the esophagus, and opens when you're talking to allow the air in and out of your trachea. So your epiglottis is made of elastic cartilage, and your external ear, right? And it's elastic because it has lots of elastic fibers, because if I bend my outer ear here, boing, boing, right? I want it to be able to snap right back. So you need those elastic fibers made of elastin protein to make sure it snaps back. So your ear and your epiglottis are made of elastic cartilage, and that's it. Now take a look here. This is kind of cool. So your elastic cartilage, here's what it looks like under a microscope. This is at 200 magnification total, so that's not very much. Notice lots of these little elastic thin fibers, kind of, again, creating kind of a spider webby network, but there's not as much ground substance as like what you'd find in areolar tissue, for example. And the chondrocytes and the lacunae are packed really close to each other. So check that out, very close together, and they tend to be doubled. So you'll see like a line between, sort of dividing the lacunae into two compartments. So that's typical of this. And notice how elastic cartilage tends to stain very dark. So you can compare it with hyaline in that it's the lacunae are much more densely packed in there than they are in hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage has a lot more smooth space, smooth ground substance. Okay, so bone, we already said we got osteocytes inside of our osteons. But the bone secretes salts and calcium that give it strength. And there are also collagen fibers that give it a little bit of flexibility on a microscopic scale. I mean, obviously, you're not taking your bone of an adult and going, meow, meow. Baby's different situation, right? They're pretty flexible. And of course, we have our blood. So our blood is our fluid connective tissue. And I will write blood in red here. Blood, blood. And we'll study blood a lot more detail later on when we get to the cardiovascular system. But here's a smear of human blood here. And you'll see that the ground substance, the ground matrix of blood is something called plasma. It's almost clear, it's kind of a clear yellow color. It's watery, so lots of water in there, as well as protein fibers. Then you have your red blood cells, which here look pink. But these red blood cells are nice donut shaped if this person's healthy. And the fancy term for a red blood cell is an erythrocyte. So erythro means red, cytes means cells. So these are your red blood cells. Of course, someone who has the disease sickle cell anemia, they would not have nice donut-shaped red blood cells like that. They'd be sickled because of a mutation to the hemoglobin protein. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the cardiovascular system. And you'll see scattered white blood cells called leukocytes in there. So we have different kinds of leukocytes. This one here is a neutrophil. This one here is a lymphocyte. So when we go in more detail about blood, you'll actually be able to learn all the different types of leukocytes, white blood cells, and be able to identify them under a microscope. So again, leuko means white, cytes is cells, so these are your white blood cells. And the other thing you have scattered in your fluid connective tissue called blood are little things here called platelets. So platelets are very important. There's a platelet right there. So they tend to be really tiny. There's one right there and scattered. Your platelets are basically fragments of blood cells, but they're very important because this is how you're able to have clotting occur. So if you get a cut, you don't want to just bleed forever. So platelets will come to the site and coagulate, and therefore a series of very complex, we call it a cascade of protein metabolism is going to occur, and you're actually going to get a plug there that will cause the clot. So later on when we get to immune response, we will learn exactly how the clotting mechanism works. And it's quite complicated, it involves a lot of proteins, but it's absolutely fascinating. It's amazing that these little fragments of blood cells can do all that. So, but anyway, blood is that last category, fluid connective tissue. Okay, so that is the connective tissue. So we've talked about epithelial tissue in the last lecture. We talked about connective tissue in this lecture. Again, just real quick, just to summarize again, 3 categories: connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, fluid connective tissue. The only fluid connective tissue is blood. The supporting connective tissue, we have cartilage and we have our bone. Bone, there's 2 types, compact and what's the other one? Spongy, okay. And for cartilage, we have hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Over to the connective tissue proper, 2 categories, dense and loose. The dense we have regular, irregular, and elastic. And under the loose we have areolar, adipose, and reticular. So I hope you're able to know those different categories and what the functions and the characteristics are of those categories. Okay, epithelial, connective. Let's move on to our 3rd category of tissues. So this is no longer connective tissue. This is another kind of just general tissue, and that is muscle tissue. So you guys know what muscles are, but you may not know all the different types of muscle tissues. So the first type we'll talk about is skeletal. So right here is a picture of skeletal muscle tissue. And this is the kind of muscle tissue you normally think about for muscles. This is your biceps, your triceps, your quadriceps, your sternocleidomastoid, whatever muscle you're talking about that is visible and that is under your conscious control. It's voluntary, meaning I can tell myself to raise my arm. That I just moved some skeletal muscles to be able to do that. My conscious brain can tell my arm to flex those muscles. So that is skeletal muscle. And the dead giveaway for skeletal muscle under the microscope are these striations, the stripes. So check out those striations. Aren't they cool? And you'll see, kind of rows of these stripes. So those are called striations. We say that skeletal muscle is striated. The other dead giveaway is that along each of these bands of striated muscle, you see kind of a band here that includes several nuclei. So this is a nucleus, and this is a nucleus, and this is a nucleus. And notice how they're kind of stretched out, they're kind of long, and they're all pretty much lined up. So you got a row of nuclei here, and then you got a row of nuclei there, etc. So striated muscle cells are multinucleated. That means they have more than one nucleus in each cell. And because the striated tissue kind of pushes everything towards the edge of the cell, just kind of like what we learned about adipose tissue pushing the organelles in the nucleus to the edge of the cell membrane, that's what's happening here. These nuclei are pushed, and so what you see here is the edge of the cell membrane, and these nuclei are just pushed up against it. And same thing here. So they're pushed up against that. So that's skeletal muscle tissue. Of course, we're going to be spending a lot of time in A&P studying muscles. You'll not only be able to name all the muscles and their actions, but we're going to look at the histology of muscle, and you'll be able to see exactly why these stripes occur, what's going on in terms of the proteins and how they interact with each other. And then we have cardiac muscle. So that's what we see here. This is a second type of muscle tissue, cardiac muscle, which obviously is only found in your heart, right? So that's where you find cardiac stuff. Notice that the tissue is not as uniform as it is in the skeletal. And in fact, the actual cells kind of have a Y-shaped appearance. It's kind of hard to see here, but you can kind of trace kind of how they have that Y-shaped appearance here. But what's cool is that between each of the cells are these little bands, and they're called intercalated discs. Okay, intercalated discs. These things are amazing because really what they are, remember how we talked about how cells are really close together in epithelium? Well, in cardiac tissue as well. And the openings between the cell membranes allow these cells to communicate with each other. So they exchange sodium, which causes electrical changes between the two cells. So this allows these cells to communicate with each other and hence beat together. So we'll get a lot more into that when we talk about the cardiovascular system in the heart. I mean, it's just fascinating stuff. And you'll notice that the nuclei of the cells are kind of scattered, so they're not all pushed into one line like they are in skeletal muscle. But there's an intercalated disc right there, etc. And then the third type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue, and that's what you see here. And you can see how compared to the cardiac and the skeletal, it looks kind of smooth. You're not seeing any striations. The nuclei are kind of scattered, and it's not really as uniform as what you see in skeletal muscle, but you know, it kind of is still a little bit parallel. So that's smooth muscle. So smooth muscle is involuntary, and by the way, cardiac is also involuntary, but smooth is involuntary. That means you cannot consciously control it. You can't tell it to contract or not. That's all under the part of your brain that is involuntary. It just like breathing, right? You're not telling yourself to do normal breathing. You just do it. So these line the bronchioles of the lungs. They line the walls of organs like the digestive system, your bladder from the urinary system, your reproductive system, the walls of your arteries and your veins. So anything that's not under conscious control but needs to constantly be able to contract or relax, that is caused by smooth muscle. And our final type of tissue that we're going to briefly go over is nervous tissue. And obviously nervous tissue involves the nervous system. So we're talking about your motor neurons, the neurons that are in your brain, etc. So here is a typical motor neuron. That means a neuron that is going to connect to muscles, for example, or between other neurons together. So you find nervous tissue in your brain, your spinal cord, and your nerves that run throughout your body. So typical neuron is going to have a large part here called the body. Okay, so that is your cell body of your neuron. And little projections off of that body that are going to receive signals from other neurons. And those are called your dendrites. And then there will be a long branch coming off of there that will meet up with either another cell or muscle tissue. And that's where the signal, so it receives a signal from something else, processes through the cell body and out to the axon, where certain chemical processes are going to occur, which you'll learn about later when we go over the nervous system. But it'll send that signal down to something, for example, a muscle, and that will give it the signal to contract. So that long arm there where the signal is transferred is called the axon. And then around nervous tissue, you'll have little supporting cells. So you'll learn all about this when we get to the nervous system. Okay, so neurons conduct impulses. They do it chemically. This is what's fascinating. They create electrical signals using chemicals. And then the axon sends the signals. The cell body has all the organelles, the nucleus, that's your metabolic center that receives the signal from the dendrites. So the dendrites are the first to receive those signals. So that's nervous tissue. So what I want to do right now is just go over some pictures of tissues and just have you try to identify them. What do we have here? Hyaline cartilage. So notice these lacunae with, in fact, okay, so let me highlight these. So the lacunae with the chondrocytes in them, nuclei of the chondrocytes, There's your pericardium surrounding the hyaline cartilage. And here's the chondrocytes inside of the lacunae. And there's your extracellular matrix. So there's some hyaline cartilage. Let's check out fibrocartilage. Okay, so there's fibrocartilage. Notice the wavy interwoven collagen fibers there. So there's your collagen fibers. Here's your ground substance, not too much of it. Your lacunae and the nucleus of the chondrocytes inside of the lacunae. And here's the whole chondrocytes inside your lacunae there. Let's check out some elastic cartilage. Okay, so notice elastic cartilage, very little ground substance, just a little bit there. The lacunae are all over the place. They're very tightly packed, and again, this is cartilage from your ear or your epiglottis. There's all your elastic fibers, your chondrocytes inside of your lacunae, and the perichondrium up here. Okay, so, but again, take a look at that elastic cartilage, contrast it with your hyaline cartilage. So you see the difference in the amount of ground substance there. Let's take a look at adipose tissue. Okay, so notice these huge lipids inside those adipocytes. And here's the nuclei of your adipocytes, so very small. Here are your whole adipocytes. Notice you'll get some capillaries stuck in there too, some blood vessels, so those are not part of the cells. Let's look at some reticular connective tissue. Okay, so again, check out that reticular fiber. Boom, those guys are all over the place. You got your white blood cells. Here's a special kind of white blood cell called a macrophage. Lots of ground substance everywhere. And finally, areolar. Let's look at areolar. So areolar, very spongy. This is your fascia. This is your peanut packing material. Lots of ground substance. Boom, look at all that ground substance right there. You have your fibroblasts there. You have other kinds of cells called endothelial cells. But lots of elastic fibers, the thin guys, and lots of thick collagen fibers. Now, I forgot to mention this before. The other thing you have in areolar connective tissue are mast cells. And these are really important because mast cells are what produces histamine. Histamine is that inflammatory chemical when you get an allergy, right? That's what gives you the sniffly nose and the watery eyes and the red skin when you're exposed to something you're allergic to. So you see a lot of areolar connective tissue under your columnar epithelium in your intestine, and so if you eat something that you're allergic to, boom, the mast cells of this areolar connective tissue are going to go haywire and you're not going to feel very good, right? And let's just take a look at dense regular connective tissue. So this would be of a tendon. Again, there's your fibroblasts, very little ground substance, and lots of collagen fibers, all regular. Here's your dense irregular. Okay, it's haphazard, all over the place. Very few fibroblasts. They're all scattered. More ground substance than you see in the dense regular, and lots of crazy looking collagen fibers there. And finally, your elastic connective tissue, lots of waviness that's going on there. So you have lots of wavy elastic fibers going all over the place here. So those are your elastic lamellae, as they're called. So lots of wavy, looks like little caterpillars running all over the place. And your fibroblasts are scattered. Okay, so anyway, I think you got it. Good job on this lecture, and let me know if you have any questions. We're on to the intent. I hope you had fun. Use AP Revealed, use Google Images, anything you can get. I gave you that site from University of Michigan, tissue site, interactive, where you can do kind of a virtual microscope. So the more of these images you look at and identify, the better you will know them and the better you'll do on tests and practicals. So, all right, hope you had fun. I know I did. Take care.